Folks, the topic now is men as lone parents. Australian research, boys and older children are most likely to live with their fathers if if the parents are separated. But in general, fathers are rarely the lone parents, and therefore there's kind of a dearth or a lack of research that examines their parenting. 1 in 4 lone fathers say they feel uncomfortable in that role. Maybe because men often gain custody as a result of problematic mother-child relationships, maternal health, mental health problems, or problems with a mother's new partner. So in other words, sometimes the circumstances that lead to single fatherhood are less than desirable situations. Now, moving to parenting in step families. When there's a step family, it means that, well, there's maybe there's one biological parent and then one non-biological parent. So changes in family dynamics that call for considerable adaptation by adults and children. In other words, the non-biological parent is entering into a relationship with a biological parent and his or her offspring. So what can we say about parenting by mothers and stepfather families, right? So in other words, the mother is biologically linked to the child, but the father is not. Well, here's some comments from your reading. Mothers and step families report being more negative and less positive in interactions with their children. More likely to show disengaged parenting, typified by low levels of support and control than those in first marriage families. So be that as it may, the reason for that, I don't know. But the idea is that if a mother is the mother is biologically linked to the child, but the father is not. For some reason, the quality of maternal parenting goes down. And several factors that your article points out is the time since the step family formed. If in families that have been established for several years, parenting is much the same quality as those in first marriage families. In other words, the phenomenon of lower quality mother parenting, maybe that is transient. And so after a few years, things tend to get back to normal. Second factor is the age of the children at the time of repartnering. In other words, when the mother remarries or whatever the conditions were. Relationships between mothers and young children appear to be comparatively resilient, which means that maybe there's kind of a shock effect, right? In other words, kind of a newness linked to the new marriage or the new cohabitation with the new father. But after a while, things seem to settle down, as we mentioned earlier. A third factor is the gender of the child. Girls whose mother repartner have more fraught relationships than do boys. So in other words, the daughter in the family in which the mother is the biological mother, but the father is not biologically the father. The girls tend to have more problems than the boys do as children. Maybe because a girl and her lone mother form a particularly close relationship. So in other words, maybe the girls have a special kind of tendency to kind of resent the new father that has entered the picture. That's just a speculation from your reading. Boys, on the other hand, may benefit from the presence of a male adult in the house. So in other words, maybe boys would be a little bit more welcoming of having another guy around in the house. So there seems to be a gender difference from the child's perspective in terms of how an adult entering the house, in other words, a new father coming in is accepted and the relationship there. And then another factor that enters into this equation of how stepfathers would interact in the family is the particular aspect of parenting being considered. In other words, when mothers are repartnered, they showed less harsh discipline techniques, and their children reported closer mother-child relationships than the mother who had been single, since when their mother had been single. So the idea is, well, maybe supervision did not improve with repartnering after marriage, perhaps because of the associated residential changes disrupts or reduces monitoring by parents. So the idea here is that maybe, you know, it's parenting is a thing that has many different aspects, and therefore it's difficult to say, gee, did parenting as a whole get better or worse? Well, it kind of depends on which aspects of parenting that you're focusing on. That's what the comment there means. It could be interpreted as. Okay, parenting by stepfathers. In other words, what kinds of parenting are provided by the new father, right? Let's see, the men who move into parenting roles in relation to their partner's children face the task of building new relationships. And one of those hurdles to be overcome, or challenges, is often the children that are taking in a new, that are now part of a family with a new father that has entered the picture. They also have another father. Often they have a non-resident father who is more or less involved in their lives, but the day-to-day parenting falls to their mother and their stepfather. So, in other words, there's another guy that's not in the picture now. Now he may be in touch with the children, right? But he's not involved with the day-to-day activities. But they have a history. So in other words, the original biological father, who is no longer in the family, has maybe established a nice bond with the children. So they do have that history. They've gone through the infancy and early childhood with perhaps with the child. So there's so they see their stepfather, the new guy, as competition for their mother's attention. So maybe there's maybe there's an element of jealousy there. Like mothers and stepfamilies, stepfathers are less likely than fathers, stepfathers are less likely than fathers in intact families to monitor children's behaviors. They're more likely to be engaged in permissive parenting. In other words, they tend to be maybe more permissive, right? Remember, we're talking about permissive as one of the three major kinds of parenting: permissive, authoritarian, and then authoritative. So permissive would be high levels of warmth and low levels of control. So in other words, less likely to show discipline, discipline in a loving way. So the stepfathers often, not always. Remember, any comment we're making here does not apply to everybody, but in general, research has found that stepfathers tend to be kind of, maybe a little more lenient with children. Okay, what about the families in which the father is the biological father, but the mother is the non-biological parent, right? So those would be called the stepmother families, which are they're going to be maybe a little less rare. Little research has taken place in this area, probably because as a group they are a small minority of stepfamilies, because fathers' new partners usually assume primary parenting. So let's. So the mother, in other words, the non-biological mother that has now entered the family is new in her interaction style with the child, probably. So she doesn't have a lot of experience with the child yet. So it makes the task of being a stepmother difficult if she takes a major parenting role in the family. In other words, she really doesn't have experience to understand the family dynamics. So she's coming in as a newbie, right? In other words, she doesn't have a lot of experience. And look at this, the continuing specter of the wicked stepmother, right? People often, if you read fairy tales and stuff, you'll see reference to the wicked stepmother. In other words, maybe there's an assumption they have that they're going to be maybe less than optimal parenting. Furthermore, stepmothers, reading from your text here, from your article, furthermore, stepmothers are often childless when they come into a family. So they take on parenting of someone else's children with little or no experience of their own having children. So sometimes that'd be the case. Now, what about, so those are a few comments we can, that we've made about parenting by by stepmothers to their stepchildren and stepfathers to their stepchildren. Remember that we're still talking about two-parent families here, but we're talking about families in which one parent is a biological parent and the other parent is not a biological parent. Now, what about multiple transitions? In other words, parenting is usually compromised. In other words, parenting is kind of diluted in quality, maybe, as a result of parents going through transitions across several family structures. That means that, maybe there's been divorce, maybe there's been the death of a spouse. In other words, there's some kind of a disruption, some kind of a stressful set of events has precipitated today, Adolescents whose parents have adolescents, right, whose parents have had several partnership transitions report their parents provide less supervision, lower levels of acceptance, and engage in more conflict. So in other words, if parents have undergone changes in their family structure as parents, then something happens to them. They tend to show, again, they're less supervisory of their children, lower levels of acceptance and more conflict. In families where there have been few transitions, positive relationships between parents and children are more likely, right? So in other words, multiple transitions raise risk for children of adverse outcomes in the medium and long term. What that means is that the more stability there has been in the house, the fewer transitions there have been, well, the more likelihood of maybe a more optimal kind of family environment. Parenting and adoptive families. So in other words, we're saying, okay, these are families that are taking in, as opposed to being a step parent. You're talking about, taking a child in that often would have no biological relationship to the parents. So what can we say about parenting in those kinds of families? Well, we can say that higher socioeconomic status. In other words, people have maybe higher income, higher levels of education, had considerable time to prepare for being parents, because they've made a conscious decision to be parents. Is by definition, this is a deliberate decision that's been made. Hopefully very well thought out. The notion that, so in other words, you can say, well, there's been a lot of thought given to, adopting a child. An Israeli study, right? So in other words, we're just saying, well, here's a study that was done and happens to have been done in Israel, transition to parenthood by adoptive couples. It was found that in comparison with parents of naturally conceived babies, adoptive parents and adoptive parents adapted and coped better a few months into parenthood. In other words, that maybe the conscious, deliberate nature of adopting a child kind of raises the desire to prepare, to be very to prepare for the child. And people, it wouldn't be inappropriate for you or anybody to ask, what about bonding? In other words, is there a bonding period? Maybe you've heard of that idea that some scientists, right, psychologists and other scientists, social scientists and biologists would say that there's a special time shortly after birth, maybe within hours or days of birth, in which there's this kind of a special bond formed between the parents and the newborn child. But it doesn't seem to be the case with humans. A lot of that bonding comes from animal models. In other words, there does seem to be a special kind of I don't know, an emotional tracking device or something that develops in creatures as diverse as geese and bison, cows. Maybe there's some kind of a special thing that has a special recognition mechanism that is established mainly between the mother and the children, or I should say the mother and the offspring. So it doesn't seem to be the case, as far as we know, for humans. It doesn't seem to be that simple. In a study of comparative attachment classifications at 11 to 18 months of age, the differences were found in groups of non-adopted, adopted. No differences were found in this whatever you call attachments, right, between parents and children, between non-adopted and adopted infants, in this case of the same race. You know, so an attachment is an emotional bond, right? So you can have secure attachments between infants, and in other words, what does the child think of the parent? Is the bond secure? We have a secure bond. We have an ambivalent bonding, and in other words, ambivalent kind of attachment, or it's kind of a love-hate, not love-hate, but maybe not so firmly in the love direction. And then we have kind of an aversive or an avoidant type of attachment, where there really is no strong emotional connection. So the idea is, well, attachment class, that's probably what they're talking about here when they attachment classifications. In other words, whether you're, to summarize that, whether you're adopted or you're a naturally born child to the family, your bonding doesn't seem to have doesn't seem to be impacted by that. So being biologically born or adopted does not seem to have an impact on bonding, if you want to use that term. Okay, another aspect here. They have legal rights as parents, adoptive parents do, but does not mean they're psychologically or emotionally entitled, which may affect their ability to monitor and discipline their children. Entitlement, in other words, it doesn't necessarily legal parenthood doesn't necessarily mean psychologically or emotionally connected. Distance was the factor most likely to predict difficulties. Distance encompassed feelings in parents of rejection by the child. So in other words, if there's a psychological difficulties, it may have a lot, there seems to be a strong linkage to the kind of emotional bonds that have in fact been formed. It resembles then the notion of compatibility or similarity that involves mutual ease and good communication. In other words, they're in natural childbirth. In other words, in naturally, biological children, sometimes there seems to be a better fit, a better emotional rapport, between children and their biological parents. And the same thing kind of occurs, is part of the equation for adoptive families. Let's see, low levels of permissive parenting is linked with poor impulse control of children, low levels of persistence in an adolescence, excessive reliance on peers, less involvement in academically pursuits. In other words, if the permissive parenting style is the one that's being used, well, that's in general, it's not good. Remember, the parenting styles: permissive, authoritarian, and authoritative. So permissive is bad. This doesn't involve, this observation does not particularly involve, just adoptive children. But the idea is that, well, okay, permissive parenting is bad. That's not the best way to go. Widely accepted now that secrecy about the fact that a child is adopted is ill-advised. This is interesting. This actually gets into a new area here. In other words, secrecy about the adoption. It's not the best way to go, as far as research tells us. Parents must face and handle sensitively the task of telling the children that they are adopted. In other words, it's probably a good idea to let people know that they are adopted. And a lot of the the research, a lot of the information says that it's important to provide as much information about genetic parents as possible. So children begin to ask, there is a, the observation that children begin to ask it sometimes around the age of 3 or 4 years of age. Maybe because they discuss things with their own friends that children do. I don't know why, but it seems to be a popular age for children to start wondering about their parents. Let's see, the children who are, in general, we could say that the age of adoption seems to be perhaps not surprising. If somebody's adopted at the age of, shortly after birth, they haven't really had early bonding with somebody else, and therefore it's a whole different situation. So when you have your parenting of children adopted beyond infancy entails extra challenges for parents. Early experiences of forming relationships are likely to be mixed and by definition unsatisfactory. So in other words, if somebody is adopted at a later age, where there may be some kind of a emotional experience, or maybe a memory formed, well, then that's a new set of challenges for the parents and the children to navigate together. So that's another element about the situation to consider. Next topic, just briefly, in general, the adoption seems to be, earlier is better in general. In other words, if somebody's going to adopt a child, in general, for overall adjustment, as far as I know, it's best for the adoption to happen as early in the child's life as possible, as close to birth as possible. Open adoption is the idea that everybody is aware of what's going on. In other words, in an open adoption, there's no secrets at all. In other words, there's a lot of lots of contact between adopted children and their birth parents, and even the adoptive parents are in touch with the biological parents. So that'd be the prime definition of open adoption. Some research has compared adoptive families with 4 levels of openness, reflecting concerns of advocates for and against open adoption, including aspects of adoptive parents' feelings about the adoption of their child. In other words, there were lots of digging into the views and the feelings of all the parties involved. Research has been supportive of openness. In other words, there doesn't seem to be any downside to open adoption, as far as I know. Parents in fully disclosed adoptive groups were significantly more likely to communicate fully with their child about the adoption. One of the important psychological schools is the humanistic approach, right? Humanistic emphasizes the importance of honesty and openness. So certainly, open adoption would be consistent with that view of life in general. But here's a couple of some important observations in the area of open adoption. The notion of shared fates between the adoptive family and the birth family, linked by the child. In other words, that there's kind of a it's like, well, everybody has a stake. In other words, everybody has an interest in the well-being of the child. In this case, the adopted child that is also in touch with his or her biological family. And then another important part of the findings are the concepts of entitlement, permanence, and coherence about their roles suggest that adoptive parents can and do take on that identity. In other words, in an open adoption, they're not pretending to be something that they're not. They're very upfront, very honest about who they are, and they're not pretending to be biological parents. Transracial adoption. Infants adopted transracially are more likely than those adopted intraracially, that is to say within the same racial group, to be insecurely attached at 18 months old. Right, so you can have an insecure attachment, which can be ambivalent or avoidant. But the idea is that if you have the best kind of attachment, emotional attachment of a child with his or her parents would be the secure attachment. So transracial adoptions tend to lead to a higher amount of insecure attachments. However, this did not appear to be because of lack of social support or problematic pre-placement history. Most studies of interracially adopted children indicate good adjustment. Higher rates of attachment in transracially adopted children occurred because it took more time for parents to adapt to infants of a different race. So in other words, if there are any downsides to transracial adoptions, they tend to kind of go away after a while. You know, they're there for a while, but the initial distances, in the words of your article, are the initial distances, emotional distances become less serious with time. Parenting in foster family, infant placed in other words, foster family. These are families that have, you may recall, are taking children in for a brief time, for some kind of a time interval that is by definition is limited. Infants placed in foster care between birth and 20 months of age form secure attachments at the same rate as biological parent-infant parents. So parent-infant pairs, right? So attachments seem to be pretty strong. Now, whether that's good or not, because it's going to be disrupted later. Okay, a second major factor in parenting in foster families is the constellation, or the variety of attitudes and expectations held by the parents themselves, including, in other words, the parents are aware of the impermanence of the arrangement, and maybe they'll be a little bit less open, a little bit less accepting, a little bit less emotionally attached to the children if they know they're going to leave soon. And foster parents are, in other words, temporary parents are less likely to provide nurturance to babies who do not elicit it. In other words, nurturance means, tender interaction. And that, some infants are able to, to kind of elicit that, but biological mothers tend to be very nurturant regardless of what their infants are like. And fostered infants themselves appear to have low expectations of nurturance. Hence, the relationship is likely to be comparatively low key. So in other words, maybe the foster family arrangement is a little bit less emotionally invested than the traditional adoption or the biological parent-child interaction. Okay, now let's look at some information about, in this case, in vitro fertilization. In other words, using a technology for fertilization of an egg that's in other words, not a normal pregnancy, but it's scientifically done. It's a test tube bait. You've heard of that? Maybe you've heard of that term. High levels of anxiety during pregnancy. In other words, see, the way this works, as I understand, is that you're going to have a fertilized egg, but the point is the egg is removed from a mother, and then the egg is going to have the insertion of a nucleus from another individual. So, in other words, instead of having normal sexual reproduction, you're producing an egg in a laboratory in a test tube, and then you're putting that egg into the uterus of a woman that wants to carry the egg and have a pregnancy. High levels of anxiety during pregnancy and anticipation of infant difficulty. Parent-child relationships in families with preschool children born by in vitro fertilization, IVF, have been compared with those of naturally conceived parent-child pairs. And look at this, no differences were found in this particular study group, research group subjects on measures of parent-child relationship or parental psychosocial functioning. In other words, it's just because somebody has engaged in vitro fertilization doesn't mean necessarily that there's a difference in the emotional investment. Mothers at the age of between 4 and 8 years old, mothers of in vitro fertilization children were warmer, more emotionally involved, and experienced less parenting stress than mothers of naturally conceived children. So I don't know. It's like, geez, we went through a lot of trouble to bring this about. So maybe there's a special bond that happens because of IVF. The authors of this study that were cited concluded that a strong desire for children is more important in relation to good parenting than a genetic relationship. So genetics isn't everything. In vitro fertilization, IVF is perfectly okay. Perfect. In other words, as far as emotional involvement, it's perfectly normal. Has the potential for being a very positive type of bonding and emotional investment situation. Now, comparisons had experienced in vitro fertilization and adopted versus naturally conceived between IVF and adopted groups. So you have mothers in infertility groups. In other words, they were now, if you're infertile, the way to have a children, you can use the IVF, you can use technology like IVF, or you can use adoption. Mothers in the infertility groups were found to be less sensitively responding to the adolescence. In other words, at a later time, at the age of 12 years old, than mothers in the natural conception group. Fathers and mothers in the adoptive family showed less warmth toward their teenagers than those in the in vitro fertilization families. So now there's lots of information. So maybe there's a difference that comes out not necessarily in the early times, early times of raising the children, but maybe there are differences that show up later in this case in the adolescent stage of the children's lives. It is impossible to determine from these studies whether these differences arise from changes in adolescent behavior and perceptions or from changes in parental attitudes. So in other words, people, when you're an adolescent, you're going through changes yourself. So it's difficult to say definitively that maybe that the method of the child entering the household was fully responsible for any differences in emotional bonding or emotional interactions that later occurred. As we know from, maybe you've heard of Erik Erikson, who has a theory about development, and he says that identity formation, identity is an important aspect of the adolescent years, which is, typically considered to be like 11 to 17 years old. For artificial reproductive technology teenagers, their biological identity is particularly complicated. In other words, determining my past biological history as a teenager is difficult for somebody who's been the product of technology or even adoption. The findings of research suggest that method of conception is not a strong factor in determining parental practices and children's responses. So in other words, children tend to be fairly normal, right? To date, studies in a variety of countries using a range of measures and informants. And in other words, many different kinds of subjects and individuals participating in the studies. Few systematic differences in family functioning amongst families formed by ART and those, that'd be artificial reproductive technologies here. Like in vitro fertilization. In other words, IVF, in vitro fertilization, is an example of ART, right? The artificial reproductive technology. And so if you're the product of technology, or you're adopted, or you're naturally conceived, there isn't really much that you can say that would that would cause differences between those three methods of bringing a child about. So in other words, you're okay regardless of how you came to be. So there's a couple of some conclusions that are made at this juncture of the article here. Parenting in lone parent and step families compares adversely with that in intact families. In other words, however, these differences are notable mainly in the early phases after the transition from the previous family structure. So in other words, there's some evidence that parenting styles by parents, by single parents or step families in which, the father is biological or the mother is biological. In general, there may be some negative aspects of those situations, particularly in families that have experienced multiple transitions. In other words, maybe there have been a couple of, maybe it's the second or third divorce, that kind of thing. At least in childhood, and this is another conclusion, at least in childhood, the quality of parenting and adoptive, and especially in artificial reproductive technology families compares favorably. In other words, at least in childhood, there doesn't seem to be any difference in the quality of the parenting. And family structure in itself is not predictive of parenting quality. The evidence from open adoption suggests traditional structure of nuclear families is in itself unimportant for parenting. In other words, what's a nuclear family? Well, a nuclear family is two biological parents with their biological children. So open adoption studies, research has suggested that there's not a particular magical benefit that comes automatically with the nuclear family. The children in all kinds of families can experience a very positive, life history in their families. At least for children. Notice that your textbook points out that these findings, as they apply predominantly to the childhood years, the situation may be different for adolescents. So, most of the work is done with children. This is why, the researchers have suggested that people should maybe consider other, further longitudinal studies that examine adjustments in children even after their childhood. In other words, going into adolescence. Another finding here, right? It's another basic statement we can make. Biology and genetic relationships do not appear to be important predictors of parenting. If you're an adoptive parent, or you're particularly if the children are adopted in infancy, shortly after birth, and our ART parents are quite as competent, involved, and committed to their children as our biological parents. This is interesting. Where differences exist, they are usually in favor of artificial reproductive technology parents. Probably because, I'm thinking, well, they've gone, a parent whose child or children were conceived by artificial reproductive technology, really put a lot of effort into gaining the offspring. So there's a strong bond then. What then does matter? The evidence points to family members' histories of relationships and change. So as we mentioned, if somebody's undergone through a series of divorces or a series of life changes in the family, in other words, parents that have experienced more than one change in their spouse, that kind of thing. Transitions represent stresses and challenges that sap their emotional and other resources. Therefore, parenting deteriorates during and after structural changes in a household. In other words, if there's a step parent entering, or a step in, whether it's the step parent, stepfather, stepmother, change is stressful. So the number of relationship changes that people have had to go through before their current partnership is linked with the quality of their parent-child relationships. Significant problems are faced by children whose parents have had several transitions. Adult transitions are a significant risk factor for children because they're stressful. So the major corollary, in other words, the other opposite, in other words, what follows logically is the stability of relationships is a crucial aspect of parenting and well-being for children. Here are some comments about development. Young children are especially vulnerable to making and breaking significant relationships. You may recall, or you may, that Erickson, I don't know how much we've talked about it, but Erickson, as the first stage is trust versus mistrust. So in other words, Erickson's a famous psychologist that contributed, the stage theory of development throughout life. So the first stage is called trust versus mistrust, which lasts for maybe the first year and a half or so of life. So the ability to trust themselves and others in relational matters is substantially established in the early years. So building trust needs the foundation of, is off to a good start if there's a trusting type of situation or relationship in the, shortly after birth. In middle years, in middle childhood, the establishment of friendships with peers becomes important. Adolescence is an especially vulnerable time for identity and self-concept, according to Erickson and many other psychologists. So that perhaps adolescents are interested in finding out about themselves. So the more satisfying answers they can get is better for them. For adopted and ART children who are aware of their different origins, questions of genetic identity will become important as they enter, particularly adolescence. People are interested in who they are and where they came from. Another characteristic of adolescence, not only establishing an identity, is the emergence of the need for autonomy. In step families, parent-adolescent relationships deteriorate to a greater extent than they do in intact families. So in other words, maybe for an adolescent, maybe being in a step family can lead to less of an attachment to the two parents, one of whom is a step parent. Maybe it'll lead to, leaving home. And it is no coincidence that adolescents in step families are more likely to leave home and to leave home because of conflict than those in lone parent or intact families. So that'll be those are the comments. That'll conclude this recording. And the end of the article talks about implications for clinical practice. In other words, that's perfectly okay for you to take a look at that if you'd like. In other words, what kind of issues are important for clinical psychologists that are doing group counseling or marital and family counseling. So that'll do it for this recording. Okay.